Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I am Pedro, and today's episode is called Consciousness and Metamaterials. Now, as we go along, you'll understand why. So let's start with American Cosmic, published by Oxford University Press, written by Dr. Diana Pasulka. She starts the book talking about an experience she had where a NASA scientist, an engineer, someone who is in charge of launches, mission control, approaches her and wanting to learn from her. And at first, she's a little confused because she's a scholar of Catholic history and philosophy. This scientist is an engineer. And so, given how different their disciplines are, what could she possibly teach him about engineering? And this is what he told her. He told her that, quote, I have mentors in the space program. One of them, who is now retired, explained that the next discovery in my field is going to come from your field. I am at the limit of understanding what I can from a materialist perspective. My mentor explained that mysticism, religion, and consciousness is where I need to go to learn what's next, that the mind machine interface is the next frontier. Okay. So he's not talking about Neuralink. Okay. He's not talking about some machine that's going to read your brain waves and then interpret those brain waves into some kind of picture. Okay. Because some computer recorded your brain waves in the past while you explained what you were looking at. Okay. He's talking about consciousness, mysticism, and religion. Okay. Um, and what he did was he took Dr. Pasulka and Dr. Gary Nolan from Stanford University, and he blindfolded them and took them to a UFO crash site. Okay. And he had gotten permission from his superiors to do this. Okay. And this crash site was in New Mexico. It was a crash that happened in 1947, and it was not the Roswell crash, but there were eyewitnesses, and one of them had been a child at the time. Okay. And what they did was they went looking for pieces of metal, okay, um, so that Gary Nolan could study them in his lab. Now, where was this? She doesn't say, but if you read Jacques Vallée's book Trinity, the Best Kept Secret, he talks about his own search for metal, okay, specifically at the plains of San Augustine, with again in the context of UFO crashes in New Mexico, that happened in the 1940s. And he talks about how so-called army grunts um, threatened locals and did everything to pick up the strange pieces of metal. And it turns out that he had found something that he could study in his lab. Now, Jacques Vallée and Diana Pasulka are friends. Okay, she's been to his house. So if we start from the assumption that they went to the same place at different times, of course, in two different excursions, but if we start from the assumption that they went to the same place and combined their, experiences, we find that there's only one place they could have gone to, and that's the location of the Corona saucer crash. Um, like Pasulka, there's a crash from the 1940s in New Mexico. It's not the Roswell crash. And like Jacques Vallée is in the plains of San Agustin, and the army did threaten the child witness and his adult relatives, and it did happen in 1947. And just like in the case of Jacques Vallée and Diana Pasulka, as late as the 2010s, people were still looking for stuff. So Gerald Anderson is that child witness, and he was recorded in 1991, and his interview can be watched on the U.S. National Archives YouTube page of all places. I really recommend you listen to the entire interview because it is fascinating. He talks about the craft, he talks about the damage to the craft, he talks about dead aliens, he talks about one alien that survived and how he interacted with it as a child. And that's what we're going to listen to because that's very important. Uh, because in this instance, you're going to see that the alien communicated with him telepathically. So compared to humans, This being is intensely telepathic. So let's listen to Gerald Anderson's account of that experience, shall we? So here we go at the 1323 mark, like I told myself.
This is a dead thing, and it scared me, and I ran around behind my father and my uncle, and this thing was sitting there on the ground, and it kept looking back and forth, and it just had its hands like this in its lap, and it just kept looking back and forth between the three of them, and like it was trying to understand. And all of a sudden, it just turned and looked right straight at me, between my Uncle Ted and myself. And this is when it was just like an explosion of things in my head, things I started, feeling just terrible depression, loneliness, and fear, and just, awful feelings that just suddenly burst into my mind. And I don't know if that meant that it was communicating with me, and I was the only one there I could communicate with because I was a kid. I don't know. I turned and ran, and I ran across the arroyo and up on the area that it had bounced off of during the crash, and was just standing there looking down at this scene,
Like I said, you got to listen to the whole thing. It's really incredible what he was saying. So there, I shared that part just to establish the fact that this being, compared to us, was intensely telepathic. Okay. Now, let's go on to Dr. Diana Pasulka. She was at the Plains of San Agustin, as we had established. And here on the Joe Rogan Experience, she talks about what her and Dr. Gary Nolan found with the NASA space engineer. Thank you, Joe Rogan.
Yeah, was near it. I've never, and I don't. So
malleable.
And Gary and I were both sweat.
Yeah. Wandering's a bad word.
Here we go.
Like a small.
Not this big, because it's too important, and we need to have the best minds on this information, this data, this material, and so they're kind of like outsourcing.
How big were these pieces?
So these pieces that I found weren't very big. I mean, they were about, one of them was about like this big, right?
Okay, like so the size of a pack of gum?
Yeah. And the actual frog skin type thing was probably about this big.
Like a small notebook?
And we found a couple of those.
Mm-hmm. You found a couple of those just wandering around this area?
Well, we weren't wandering. We were actually digging in and looking. And yeah.
Wandering's a bad word.
That's okay.
Exploring.
Yeah.
This frog skin, what is it? Is it malleable? Is it?
Yes, it's malleable. And you could crunch it up and it'll go back to its original form.
I've heard of that before. That was something that they talked about at Roswell, that there was some bizarre metal that you could crumple up like a piece of paper and it would flatten right back out. And that's what you experienced?
I don't know if it was the same material, but yes.
Similar.
Yeah, it was like
What did that feel like when you did that?
If you want to know what it felt like, listen to the whole interview on the Joe Rogan Experience. It's excellent. He's such a great interviewer, and she's brilliant. So please watch the whole thing. Now, what she picked up was similar to what was found in Roswell. Mac Brazel Jr. is the son of Mac Brazel Sr., who owned the ranch where the Roswell disc initially crashed. So it had slammed into the earth, on his ranch, and then it kept flying for who knows how many miles till it found its final resting place where it was then recovered by the military. But because they had made that initial crash on the Brazel Ranch, it left a bunch of debris. And let's listen to Brazel Jr. because he tells a story about how his father told him what happened, and all the military went and collected stuff on the ranch. And once everyone was gone, all the military was gone, he wanted to know if there was anything left for him. So he got on his horse. He was about 20 years old, and he went looking for stuff, and he found it. So let's see what he says.
The Army may be getting to the bottom of all this talk about the so-called flying saucer. As a matter of fact, the 509th Atomic...
And then the foil, like tin foil or lead foil, but you couldn't crease it and make it stay. And I only had one little jagged piece of this. And you bend it over, make a crease, and it'd straighten right back out.
Hmm.
And it wouldn't, I don't know, it had to hit with a terrific force.
So again, he talks about something that looks like lead foil or tin foil. You bend it, it won't make a crease that lasts. It just goes back to its original shapes, similar to what Dr. Pasulka described. Now we can listen to Frankie Rowe. Frankie Rowe was a little girl at the time, and her father was a Roswell fighter. And she tells a story about how she was at the fire station and she saw this strange metal. So let's listen to Frankie Rowe at 5:30.
Tell me what happened when your dad came home that day.
The very first time that I heard about this at all. Okay. Daddy came home from work, came home at noon and picked me up. And I had gone to the doctor and was sitting in the kitchen part of the fire station. And I was eating a glass of ice chips. And a state policeman came in and he yelled at Daddy. He said, "Hey, Dan, come over here." And he said, "Get all the guys. I want to show you guys something." The state policeman reached into his pocket and he said, "I don't think you guys got to see anything like this the other day." And he pulled his hand out of his pocket and it was closed up. He opened his hand over the table and dropped a piece of material that when it hit the table, it was all wadded up when it left his hand, and when it hit the table, it spread out like it was water. And they were asking him, "How'd you get by with this?" And he said, well, he had helped with some of the pickup of debris, and he had managed to sneak that one piece in his pocket. He said, "I don't know how long I'll get."
So yeah, that's incredible. And if you need help kind of imagining what this was like, here's a really cool clip from a movie that was made in 1994 about Roswell. So let's watch it real quick.
I scratch it. Watch this. I fold. And I fold. And just for good measure, I fold again. Abracadabra.
How did he do that?
Beats me.
It's all of us. So here you go. So you have the Pasulka piece from San Agustin. You have the Roswell pieces testified about by Brazel and Rowe. What I want to kind of explore here is answering a question. And the question I have is, what is the purpose? What's the purpose of this kind of material? Okay. And I go back to this quote by the NASA engineer. Okay. I think that we are all at the limit of understanding what we can from a materialist perspective when it comes to the UFO phenomenon. And that consciousness is where we need to go to learn what this is all about. Okay. So, what's the purpose? Okay. I think there's a clue, a major clue in the existence of nitinol. Okay. Now, nitinol was invented in 1959 at the Navy Ordnance Lab. It's an alloy of nickel and titanium. Okay. So if you don't know what an alloy is, for example, electrum is an alloy of gold and silver. It's when you mix two different metals together. Okay. And again, this is the official story, right? Everyone says nitinol was invented in 1959 at the U.S. Naval Ordnance Laboratory. Okay. Now, remember, the San Agustin crash happened in 1947. The Roswell crash happened in 1947. And 10 years later, we invent nitinol. Okay, now if you don't know what nitinol is, let's watch a little clip. And it should remind you of the Roswell material.
This is no ordinary paperclip. In fact, it's made from Nitinol, and it has some, unique qualities. Let's bend it into a completely different shape. Okay, I think that should do. Now watch what happens when I drop this into some hot water. Now that is pretty darn cool. Nitinol is also known as memory metal, and once it reaches a certain heat, the atoms become locked into the previous arrangement that they were forged in. This is also the same material that magicians use to bend spoons. Sorry to ruin the magic. So there we have it, Nitinol. Don't forget to check out my Facebook and Twitter, the links are below, and as always, I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.
So that's Nitinol, folks. Now, so it has that, that property, that memory metal property, that it can remember its original shape and return to it. Now, there's more to that, because here's the thing. The Roswell wreckage was taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Okay. And at Wright Air Development Center, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the Battelle Memorial Institute back in 1952, they were already experimenting with titanium-based alloys. Okay. So at the Battelle Memorial Institute at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, just 5 years after Roswell, they're already experimenting with titanium-based alloys. And again, this is the place where the Roswell wreckage was taken. And, after Nitinol is invented, some almost 20 years later, if you go on CIA FOIA, you find this interesting document, and it's a record of a parapsychology conference that happened in Reykjavik, Iceland. Okay, it's called Mind Over Matter: The Frontiers of Physics Conference. And basically, you had the scientists from the United States, France, Great Britain, Denmark, and Sweden presenting laboratory data confirming the existence of the human mind as playing a role in physical events. Okay. And one of those scientists was Eldon Byrd, a researcher at the U.S. Naval Surface Weapons Center's White Oak Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. Byrd elaborated on the extraordinary ability of a wide variety of geographically dispersed subjects to alter the properties of nitinol, a peculiar nickel titanium alloy which once bent out of shape can revert back to its original form under certain temperature conditions. Okay, so why is this relevant? Well, remember, nitinol was invented supposedly at the Navy Ordnance Lab. Okay, and this guy, Eldon Byrd, is working at the Naval Surface Weapons Center's White Oak Laboratory. Okay, well, the Navy Ordnance Lab, so what happened was this: the Navy Ordnance Lab had closed, and the White Oak Laboratory was merged with the Naval Weapons Laboratory to become half of the Naval Surface Warfare Center. So in other words, White Oak Laboratory, it's the same laboratory, so the laboratory where nitinol was invented was also the scene for experiments with nitinol and psychokinesis. I'm going to say that again. The laboratory where nitinol was invented was also the scene for experiments with nitinol and psychokinesis. And this tracks with other things people have said. This isn't an original thought on my part. If you read Witness to Roswell, if you watch the documentary Accidental Truth, they talk about nitinol as being our cheap knockoff version of the Roswell material. To give you kind of an example of this, an allegory, you know, take the cargo cults of the South Pacific, right? These human beings who aren't as technologically advanced than us, they see airplanes, they think it's the gods, and what do? They make their own kind of mock airplanes out of wood, okay? So nitinol is to the Roswell material what these cargo cult mock airplanes are to the Zero, okay, the Japanese Zero, essentially, right? They are to a real airplane what nitinol is to the Roswell material, and this tracks because if you read Grant Cameron UFO Sky Pilots, Pilots of Peace and Oneness, he collects a bunch of experiencer narratives, a bunch of stories from people who have been abducted. And these people who get abducted, a lot of them, what they say is that the aliens let them fly the flying saucer. The aliens let them fly the craft. And how do you fly these craft? You fly them with your mind. Okay. So, according to these humans who claim to have gone into these flying saucers, these alien craft, if you're going to fly it, you fly it with your mind. Okay, so let's take this at face value because it tracks with the Kona Blue documents. Okay, remember the Kona Blue documents were the sales pitch OSAP was making to the Department of Homeland Security to keep the program alive because DIA, Department of the Defense Intelligence Agency, okay, was done with OSAP, right? So since the Defense Intelligence Agency wasn't going to be the client anymore, they were looking for a new client within the government, and so they were looking to continue the program at the Department of Homeland Security. And the Kona Blue slides are essentially the sales pitch for an unacknowledged wave special access program, which is the highest secrecy that exists. Okay. And the purpose was to facilitate a tech transfer from Lockheed Martin to Bigelow Aerospace. What kind of tech? Alien tech. Okay. Crashed flying saucer, crashed craft of some kind. And if you look at the Kona Blue documents, one of the things it tells us is that they were going to study consciousness interactions with and control of technology. What technology? The alien craft. Okay, and the medical center part of this program was going to study physiological and psychological effects of interaction with vehicles and anomalous phenomena. Okay, so both the Kona Blue documents and these experiencer narratives, these abductee, close encounter of the fourth kind stories, all point to this idea that to pilot these alien craft, you pilot them with your thoughts. Okay, and so if nitinol is our cheap knockoff version of the Roswell material, and if nitinol has some of the physical properties of the Roswell material, albeit, third rate in comparison, and if nitinol is more amenable to psychokinesis, more amenable to mental influence than steel, let's say, then that would mean that the Roswell material is more amenable to psychokinesis. It is more amenable to mental influence than nitinol, because nitinol is supposed to be a knockoff of the Roswell material. Okay, so if the Roswell material is, is super malleable and amenable to psychokinesis, right? If it's if it's really easily influenced by mental force, then that would explain why nitinol is also very malleable and why they were experimenting with nitinol and psychokinesis. Okay, so that's really interesting, I think, and I think it explains a lot, because if you pilot these flying saucers, these UFOs with your mind, then there has to be some kind of interface between the craft and the mind. And whatever mechanism that is, it would only make sense that it would be composed of some kind of material which is more amenable to some psychokinetic effect, to some kind of mental influence, more so than nitinol is, and more so than steel is, for example. Okay. So that's what I think is happening. And if you want to learn more, like I said, read Witness to Roswell or watch Accidental Truth. But I think that's where this is all pointing, and I think that's interesting. And again, it just goes to show that the NASA space engineer who talked to Diana Pasulka is right. If we want to understand UFOs better, we got to look at mysticism, religion, and consciousness. Okay, because we are at the limit of what we can understand from a materialist perspective. And I think I've just shown that if we do that, we can uh, further deduce the purpose of this anomalous material from Roswell. And we can also explain how not only is nitinol our cheap human knockoff of it, but why the same laboratory that produced nitinol was running psychokinetic experiments with nitinol. Okay. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening to Thoughts and Bolts. Until next time, remember, we are all one. Peace and party on.